Welcome back everybody to the Sojourning Writer. Today we're going to continue our world building series by finally getting to the book Guns, Germs, and Steel. Last time we took a look at a number of different creation stories from around the world, but now we will be taking a look at what is believed to be early human civilization. While most of our world building never makes it to the page, we can still benefit from understanding how humans developed since we first began to gather as groups. As we go, we will see that human behavior hasn't changed much since the beginning, and from these early behaviors, we can estimate a trajectory of future human behavior. Guns, Germs, and Steel: The Fates of Human Societies by Jared Diamond, Chapters 1 and 2. We will only be taking a look at the first couple chapters of the book this time. My plan is to go more in depth for the whole book, taking sections of the text for each book. That being said, I will be skipping a lot of interesting information, and as I always suggest, be sure to take a look at the book for yourself, so you can get the most out of it. As always, I'll be linking some of the information I use in the description below. Chapter 1. Cro-Magnon garbage heaps yield not only stone tools, but also tools of bone, whose suitability for shaping, for instance, into fishing hooks, had apparently gone unrecognized by previous humans. Tools were produced in diverse and distinctive shapes, so modern that their functions as needles, aws, engraving tools, and so on are obvious to us. It is believed that humans first came from Africa before migrating to modern-day Europe. This group is commonly called Cro-Magnon. From Europe, they moved west into Asia and eventually into Americas. Here's a picture of the possible migration pattern across the world. Recognizable multi-piece weapons at Cro-Magnon sites include harpoons, spear throwers, and eventually bows and arrows, the precursors of rifles and other multi-piece modern weapons. Those efficient means of killing at a safe distance permitted the hunting of such dangerous prey as rhinos and elephants, while the invention of rope for nets, lines, and snares allowed the addition of fish and birds to our diet. Remains of houses and sewn clothing testify to a great improved ability to survive in cold climates, and remains of jewelry and carefully buried skeletons indicate revolutionary aesthetic and spiritual development. While it is believed that there are other human-like species like the Cro-Magnons, such as Neanderthals, the technological development allowed more of the Cro-Magnons to flourish and outpopulate the others. Being able to bring down large prey safely not only allows for a larger population beyond the small family groups, but also for a faster population growth. A group that can only feed itself by foraging food will not be able to support as many people, whereas a group able to feed itself with protein-rich foods like meat can support larger family groups. With larger family groups, the more complex the family interactions can be, hence the discovery of aesthetic and spiritual items. Anyone who's experienced firsthand the overwhelming power of the life-size painted bulls and horses in the Le Creux cave in southwestern France will understand at once that their creators must have been as modern in their minds as they were in their skeletons. There's a little difference in between those that painted in the caves and modern humans. Technology is what makes up those primary differences. I believe if we take an infant from that time and brought them up in a modern setting, there would be little and noticeable differences between them and the rest of society. With a few thousand years, there were no more Neanderthals, who had been evolving as the sole occupants of Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. That sequence strongly suggests that the modern Cro-Magnons somehow used their far superior technology and their language skills or brains to infect, kill, or displace the Neanderthals, leaving behind little or no evidence of hybridization between Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons. A core element of human interaction is the otherization of people outside the local population. In fact, the idea of outgroup preference is only found in highly westernized countries, and nowhere else. Then, only in specific portions of those countries. During the Ice Age, so much of the ocean's water was locked up in glaciers that worldwide sea levels dropped hundreds of feet below their present stand. As a result, what are now shallow seas between Asia and the Indonesian islands of Sumatra, Borneo, Java, and Bali became dry land. So did other shallow straits such as the Bering Strait and the English Channel. The edge of the Southeast Asian mainland then lay 700 miles east of its present location. Free passage between the continents was the most likely reason for such a wide dispersal of animals and humans across the world, though it is possible, when the Earth was in its Pangea state, animals and some humans drifted with the continents, the humans living there until the arrival of the Cro-Magnons much later. But Australia and New Guinea formerly had its own suite of diverse big animals, including giant kangaroos, rhino-like marsupials, called diprotodonts, and reaching the size of a cow, and a marsupial leopard. It also formerly had a 400-pound ostrich-like flightless bird, plus some impressively big reptiles, including 1-ton lizard, a giant python, and a land-dwelling crocodile. Given how much later humans arrived at places like Australia and New Guinea, The bone record of those areas are much more recent and much more easier to find. The hunting to extinction of both predator and oversized prey makes sense if you're both looking to make your area safe and looking for easy food. Both early humans would have had high on their priority list. Those extinctions eliminated all large wild animals that might have otherwise been candidates for domestication and left native Australians and New Guineans with not a single native domestic animal. One of the downsides of an extinction level event of large non-predator animals is it prevents the chance of them becoming domesticated later. We will be getting into the concept of domestication in a later video. Also unresolved is the question of whether Clovis hunters were really the first Americans. What always happens whenever anyone claims the first of anything, claims of discoveries of pre-Clovis human sites in Americas are constantly being advanced. Like I mentioned earlier, we don't know when the Cro-Magnons, now Clovis, first came to the Americas, that they were actually the first ones. This can make it hard when we're trying to figure out who was the first to inhabit a land, and the idea of the original peoples is difficult to pin down, and it makes it hard to know who has perceived rights to the land. Warring tribes frequently conquered each other throughout history. It is always a good idea to take this into account when writing our stories, as this can add complexity to our world's history. Chapter 2. On the Chatham Islands, 500 miles east of New Zealand, centuries of independence came to a brutal end for the Moriori people in December 1835. On November 19th of that year, a ship carrying 500 Maori armed with guns, clubs, and axes arrived, followed on December 5th by a shipload of 400 more Maori. Groups of Maori began to walk through a Moriori settlement, announcing that the Moriori were now their slaves and killing those who objected. Still, an organized resistance by the Moriori could have still defeated the Maori, who were outnumbered 2-1. However, the Moriori had a tradition of resolving disputes peacefully. They decided in a council meeting not to fight back, but offer peace, friendship, and division of resources. Before the Moriori could deliver that offer, the Maori attacked in mass. Over the course of the next few days, they killed hundreds of Moriori, cooked and ate many of the bodies, and enslaved all the others, killing most of them over the next few years as it suited their whim. Because of how recent these events took place, we are given a possible window into a more distant past. In this chapter, we will be going over pattern differences that led up to the point that the Maori destroying their Moriori counterparts. A Maori conqueror explained, "We took possession in accordance with our customs, and we caught all the people. Not one escaped. Some ran away from us. These we killed. Others we killed. But what of that? It was in accordance with our custom." One of the things we should keep in mind when we have a clash of two cultures is first, how different the two of them are. Like with the example given, one is far more warlike, while the other had a history of resolving issues peacefully. The closer two cultures resemble each other, the easier it is for there to be integration. If two cultures are vastly different, then the closer to equal numbers, the closer to the middle the shared culture will be. As an example, if you have a more peaceful culture, but a more warlike culture is introduced, as long as the number of warlike people are relatively low, the less likely the warlike people are going to have an effect on the peaceful people. But the more warlike people who are introduced, even more so if subcommunities are allowed to form, the more the peaceful culture will begin to resemble the warlike culture. The Moriori are a small, isolated population of hunter-gatherers, equipped with only the simplest technology and weapons, entirely inexperienced at war, and lacking strong leadership or organization. Because hunter-gatherer cultures are the simplest forms of cultures, when they meet with more complex cultures, they will be overtaken by that more complex culture. With the exceptions of concerted efforts having made to preserve more simpler cultures, none of them exist anymore, as when people needed more area for their own culture to survive, hunter-gatherers were kicked out or killed. This has happened across the world. We just have records of this in New Zealand because how recent this happened. The Maori invaders from New Zealand's North Island came from a dense population of farmers chronically engaged in ferocious wars, equipped with more advanced technologies and weapons, and operating under strong leadership. Of course, when the two groups finally came into contact, it was the Maori who slaughtered the Moriori, not vice versa. It will always be the more complex cultures who survive, but the less complex are more likely to be integrated or wiped out. Both were Polynesian people. The modern Maori are the descendants of the Polynesian farmers who colonized New Zealand around AD 1000. Soon after, a group of those Maori turned to colonize the Chatham Islands and became the Moriori. In the centuries after the two groups separated, they evolved in opposite directions. The North Island Maori developed more complex, and the Moriori less complex technology and political organization. The Moriori reverted to being hunter-gatherers, while the North Island Mori turned to more intensive farming. Those opposite evolutionary courses sealed the outcome of their eventual collision. If we could understand the reasons for the disparate development of those two island societies, we might have a model for understanding the broader questions of different development in continents. By becoming an agrarian culture, meaning a culture that gets their food primarily by farming instead of hunting and gathering, they will be able to produce more food beyond what is needed for personal survival. When a culture is able to produce excess, the culture is able to become more complex. It's easy to trace how the differing environments of the Chatham Islands and of New Zealand modeled the Moriarty and the Maori differently. While those ancestral Maori, who first colonized the Chathams, may have been farmers, the Moriarty tropical crops would not grow in the Chatham's cold climate, and the colonists had no alternative except to revert to being hunter-gatherers. As hunter-gatherers, they do not produce crop surpluses available for redistribution or storage. They could not support and feed non-hunting craft specialists, armies, bureaucrats, and chiefs. Their prey were seals, shellfish, nesting seabirds, and fish that could be captured by hand or with clubs and required no more elaborate technology. In addition, the Chathams were relatively small and remote islands, capable of supporting a total population of only about 2,000 hunter-gatherers. With no other accessible islands to colonize, the Moriari had to remain at the Chathams, learning how to get along with each other. They did so by renouncing war, and they reduced potential conflicts from overpopulation by castrating some male infants. The result was a small, unwarlike population with simple technology and weapons, and without strong leadership or organization. While the horrors of war are readily understood, there are some benefits to a culture beyond the conquering and taking of land and resources. A reduction of economically unsupportable men. While this might seem like a cold perspective, history is rife with political upheaval due to, in part, a large population of unproductive men. This is one of the reasons why the Moriari would castrate infant males. In contrast, the northern and warmer part of New Zealand, by far the largest island group in Polynesian, was suitable for Polynesian agriculture. Those Maori who remained in New Zealand increased in numbers until there were more of 100,000 of them. They developed locally dense populations chronically engaged in ferocious wars with neighboring populations. With the crop surpluses that they could grow and store, they fed craft specialists, chiefs, and part-time soldiers. They needed and developed varied tools for growing their crops, fighting, and making art. They erected elaborate ceremonial buildings and prestigious numbers of forts. Having a more complex culture does not mean that the resources will be used to become more warlike, but other civilizational elements like religion and more complex tool-making are just a starting point in the possible complexity of a proto-civilization. Contributing to these differences among Polynesian societies, there are at least 6 sets of environmental variables among Polynesian islands. Island's climate, geological type, marine resources, area, terrain fragmentation, and isolation. But this does not mean that any group of people can become a more complex culture. There are a number of requirements needed to move past the hunter-gatherer culture. A political unit's population size interacted with its population density to influence Polynesian technology and economic, social, and political organization. In general, the larger size and the higher density, the more complex and specialized were the technology and organization, for reasons we shall examine in detail in later chapters. Briefly, at high population densities, only a portion of the people came to be farmers, but they were mobilized to devote themselves to intensive food production, thereby yielding surpluses to feed non-producers. The non-producers mobilizing them included chiefs, priests, bureaucrats, and warriors. As the proto-civilization continues to become more complex, the easier it will be for them to sustain non-producing people, which in turn creates a more complex culture. Political organization followed the same trends. On the Chathams and atolls, the chiefs had few resources to command. Decisions were reached by general discussion, and land ownership rested with the community as a whole rather than with the chiefs. Larger, more densely populated political units concentrated more authority with the chiefs. Political complexity was the greatest in Tonga and Hawaii, where the powers of hereditary chiefs approximated those of kings elsewhere in the world, and where lands were controlled by the chiefs and not by the commodores. Were it not for the Industrial Revolution, the advancement of complex cultures would have continued to slow, and the complexity would have slowed to the point of stagnation. Having an understanding of the formation of proto-civilizations can help us as writers create not just the foundations of our civilization, But if we can take into account the rise and falls of past civilizations, we can create a more realistic civilization that speaks to our readers. Okay, everyone, that's all I had for today. As always, I will be linking the resources I use in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave them in the comments below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.